ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
Like you're watching a movie, something in English, or even listening to a podcast, and you're totally following along.
Yeah.
Get the jokes, the little things, the nuances, and you think, man, I've got this.
Right.
But then you actually need to speak, and bam, it's like a wall. You
Yeah.
just can't get the words out. I mean,
Yeah.
does that sound familiar?
It's so common, for people learning English, you're absorbing all this language, but actually speaking, well, that uses a whole different skill set.
It really is, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today in this deep dive. It's like, why is there this gap between understanding English and speaking it? We've got this super interesting YouTube transcript we're looking at, and it really gets into this. Plus, it offers some concrete advice.
This transcript, it's packed with insights, especially if you're learning English. It really nails the difference between passive understanding, like when you're just listening, and actively speaking, which is a whole other ballgame.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It also looks at the mental blocks, like being scared to make mistakes, which we've all been there.
Oh, yeah.
And even how our first language can kind of trip us up.
Oh, for sure.
And the best part is we're not just going to point out the problems. We're going to pull out some practical techniques from this transcript, stuff you can use right away to get more confident speaking. So if you've ever felt like, okay, I get English, but speaking it, ooh, that's a mountain to climb.
Right.
Then stick with us because you're in the right place. So let's get into it, shall we?
Absolutely. So this transcript starts with a really basic point, but it's easy to miss. Understanding and speaking, they're separate skills.
Right.
It's tempting to think if you understand, speaking will just naturally happen, but it doesn't always work that way, right?
Yeah, it makes this really cool comparison. It's like thinking of speaking as a muscle. You could watch a sport, any sport, for years and understand every rule perfectly. But that doesn't mean you can just go out and play like a pro, right? You haven't actually trained those specific muscles.
It's such a good way to put it. You might spend tons of time taking in English, movies, music, podcasts, all that. And that's awesome. It builds your vocabulary, helps you get used to hearing the language.
For sure.
But if you're not actively using your speech organs, your mouth, tongue, vocal cords, even your breath, they don't get the workout they need to actually perform.
Exactly. So all that input, it's amazing for comprehension, but it doesn't magically turn into being able to speak.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The transcript then focuses on, I think, a huge obstacle for so many people. The fear of making mistakes.
Oh, absolutely. That fear of messing up, saying the wrong thing, it holds so many learners back.
For sure. And they have this coffee shop example, which I think we can all relate to. It's like, you know exactly how to order, right? The words are in your head. I'd like a cappuccino, please. Simple.
Right. You've heard it a million times.
Exactly. But then this little voice pops up and it's like, what if my pronunciation's off? What if I sound stupid? And suddenly you're frozen.
Yeah, that fear can be crippling even when you know the words, you know the grammar. It's like this mental wall that stops you from even trying. But the transcript makes a crucial point, especially when you're starting out. The goal is just to communicate your idea, not to sound like, a perfect English speaker right from the get-go.
I love that. They make this analogy with how babies learn to talk, which
makes so much sense.
It's brilliant, right? They start with these super simple phrases, often grammatically incorrect, like, want milk, me hungry, that kind of thing.
Totally.
And we get what they mean.
We do. Because language is about communication.
Yeah.
And getting your point across is often way more important than being grammatically perfect, especially at first. And this actually ties in with something called the input hypothesis by this guy, Stephen Krashen, that the transcript mentions.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Essentially, what a lot of language learning experts say is that we learn languages best when we focus on understanding meaningful communication. So when your goal is to get the meaning, not just get every single word perfect, that's when language learning happens more naturally.
Right.
And it can also help with that fear of making mistakes because the focus isn't on being perfect, it's on communicating.
That makes a lot of sense. Takes the pressure off a bit, doesn't it? Okay, so we've talked about the difference between understanding and speaking and that big hurdle of fear. What's next on the transcripts list?
So the third thing they highlight is another common trap, I think. Translating directly from your first language. And look, your native language, it's a fantastic foundation.
It is.
But if you try to translate word for word into English, it often ends up sounding weird and unnatural, and it can really slow you down when you're speaking.
They give a great example. In some languages, how old are you gets translated directly as, what is your age?
Right. And both mean the same thing.
Exactly.
But how old are you? That's the natural way to ask in English.
It is. And I guess when you're constantly translating, you're not really thinking in English, are you?
Nope, you're adding this extra step, and it can make your speech less smooth. You might also miss out on those typical English expressions and how sentences are usually structured.
It's like your brain is trying to run two language systems at the same time,
Totally.
which, yeah, that can create a bottleneck when you're trying to have a conversation.
It does.
Okay, so we've got some of the core reasons behind this disconnect. Now, for the good stuff, the
Okay.
solutions, what strategies does the transcript give us to actually start speaking more confidently?
The first one, and this is so key, is just speak more, even if it's not perfect. The transcript really hammers this point home, and it's true. Progress comes from practice, not from being perfect. And the goal initially is just get your message across, not to sound like a Shakespearean actor.
Right. And they really drive this point home. And I think it's so important. That fear of getting it wrong can be so strong.
Yeah.
But every time you push past it and speak, you're actually training your brain and
Mhm.
building those neural pathways.
It's like anything, right? The more you use those speaking muscles, the stronger they get.
Yeah.
And starting simple, like they suggest in the transcript, I like pizza, I went to the park, that builds a base and helps you get confident to try more complex stuff later on.
And it's about developing that automaticity,
Yeah.
getting your brain used to forming English sentences without having to think about every single word.
And speaking of practice, the next technique is really cool. Shadowing native speakers. Have you ever tried that?
I have. It's really effective. So the idea is you listen to a native speaker and you immediately repeat what they say, like you're their echo. You try to copy their tone, speed, pauses, everything.
So you're not just focusing on the words, you're focusing on how they're said, that musicality. Exactly. And that helps you develop a feel for the natural flow of English. It builds muscle memory in your mouth for those English sounds. And you start to internalize those natural rhythms and intonation patterns, which,
Yeah.
those are so important for sounding natural.
They really are. And the transcript gives a good example. Pick a short clip
Yeah.
from a movie, a podcast, anything, and just keep repeating it, trying to sound just like the speaker. Even doing that a little bit every day can make a difference over time.
A huge difference, and it's something you can easily fit into your day, just 5-10 minutes. The next one they mentioned might sound a little strange at first. You talking to yourself?
It does sound a bit odd, yeah.
Yeah.
But I've heard people say it's helpful.
It's super helpful, and it takes the pressure off completely. You're
Yeah.
not worried about someone judging you, right? The transcript suggests just describing your day out loud, like, this morning I had breakfast, I ate eggs and toast, or even naming things around you, like, this is a table, it's made of wood.
Like a judgment-free practice zone.
Exactly. You can stumble, make mistakes, correct yourself, and no one's listening. It lets you experiment with building sentences, try new words, and get comfy with actually speaking English without that performance anxiety. And, they even tell a funny story in the transcript about this person who talked to their plants
Right.
and saw improvement. It sounds silly, but it shows how powerful that consistent low-stakes practice can be.
I love that. Whatever works, right?
Mhm.
Okay, the next point shifts gears a bit to how we learn vocabulary. They talk about focusing on learning phrases, not just single words. Why is that so important?
Because language doesn't always work in single words. It comes in chunks, in these common phrases we use all the time. And learning those ready-made chunks can make you so much more fluent.
The examples they give are really good. Like, instead of just learning help, you learn, can you help me with this? Instead of just think, you practice, what do you think about this?
Right. Those phrases are instantly usable in conversations because they're complete units. You're not building them word by word on the spot, which can take time and, make you hesitate.
And I think there's research to back this up, right?
There is. A lot of experts in applied linguistics, they say learning in chunks gives you these ready-made building blocks for speaking, and that boosts fluency a lot.
It's like prefab construction for your sentences.
Exactly. And the transcript also says, practice these phrases in real situations, but low-pressure ones, like at a store or asking for directions. That way you're moving them from theory to real life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
What else? What other strategies do they give?
So the next one is about the social side of language learning. It's about finding people you're comfortable with to practice speaking.
That makes sense.
Because when you're with people you trust, friends, family, or even other learners, you feel more relaxed, right? You can concentrate on expressing yourself, and you're not as worried about being judged.
Totally. And the transcript mentions some cool apps for this. HelloTalk, Tandem, Speaky. Those can connect you with other learners or native speakers who also want to practice.
They're great resources. And the cool thing is everyone there is in the same boat, you know? They're all learning, they all make mistakes.
So it's less intimidating than trying to chat with someone who's already fluent.
Way less intimidating. It feels more supportive, more encouraging. Okay, so the final strategy might seem a bit surprising. It's about improving your listening skills.
Really? That's interesting. Why listening if we're trying to speak?
Because, and this is something a lot of people miss, better speaking actually starts with better listening. And not just passive listening, but active listening, where you're really paying attention to how native speakers talk, their sentence structure, their expressions, and how they respond in conversations.
So you're not just hearing the words, you're dissecting them
Yeah.
almost.
Kind of. And the transcript suggests watching things like podcasts, TV shows, YouTube videos where people are speaking naturally, and then actually engaging with the audio by pausing, repeating phrases, that kind of thing.
It's like taking it apart and putting it back together again. And I guess paying attention to intonation, like the way the voice goes up and down and the rhythm of speech, that's all important too, right?
Super important. They give this great example, the difference between really that's amazing and really are you sure?
Right. Totally different vibe.
Totally. Just by changing your tone, you change the whole meaning.
And the transcript talks about how imitation actually trains your brain to think more like a native speaker.
Yeah.
It's like you're rewiring it to process English more naturally.
You are. By actively listening and mimicking, you're absorbing the patterns of the language at a much deeper level, which then makes it easier to produce those patterns yourself when you speak.
That's fascinating. I want to touch on some of those key vocabulary and concepts that the transcript highlights, because there are some good ones in there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So we've got speak up. That just means talk louder or express yourself clearly. Pretty essential for communication.
Makes sense.
Then there's get stuck. We all know that feeling, right? When you can't think of the right word and you just sort of freeze.
Ugh, it's the worst.
It is. Then pick up a language. That's the idea of learning naturally through exposure, which is a really effective way to learn, just by being around the language.
And it ties into what we were saying about input earlier, right?
Exactly. Then there's get the message across, which is so important. It reminds us that clear communication comes first, even before perfect grammar, especially as a beginner.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And step out of your comfort zone. That's key for any kind of growth, but especially in language learning. It's about pushing yourself to try those scary things, even if you might mess up.
Which you will. We all do. The transcript also talks about take time, meaning be patient, because learning a language, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
For sure. And move on. That's about letting go of mistakes and not dwelling on them, because everyone makes them.
Work your way up highlights the fact that improvement happens gradually. You start with the easier stuff and then slowly build up to the more challenging stuff. And in the same boat is a nice reminder that you're not alone. There are tons of people out there facing the same challenges.
That's comforting, right? And finally, pay attention to, which is just a good reminder to be mindful and observant when you're learning. The little details can make a big difference.
They really can. So to wrap things up, this transcript really breaks down why understanding English and speaking it can feel so different. And more importantly, it gives us a bunch of practical strategies to bridge that gap.
The main takeaway for me is that this is something you can overcome. It takes practice, patience, and using these techniques. There's no magic bullet, but actively engaging with the language and slowly building your confidence. That's the key.
Totally. And the emphasis on just communicating your ideas instead of aiming for perfection from day one, that's so liberating. It lets you start speaking without being paralyzed by fear.
There's this great quote in the transcript that I love. It says, "Confidence comes not from being perfect, but from trying anyway." I think that really sums it up for anyone who's felt that frustration of understanding, but not being able to speak.
It's so true. So as we finish up this deep dive, here's a little something to think about. What's one small thing you can do today to practice speaking English? Maybe try shadowing a short audio clip, or describe what you're doing to yourself out loud in English. Even those little consistent efforts add up over time and can really build your confidence.
Great advice. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.